Merhabalar, hoş geldiniz.
Hello everyone, welcome. Today we have Professor Inez Myin-Germeys, whom we are proud to have here, and he is the chair of contextual psychiatry in Belgium. He has quite important researches, and in experience sampling methodology, he is an international author. In terms of statistics and for the improvement of a methodology, he has ongoing research in numerous numbers. For the natural course of psychotic features, he is working for adolescents to identify the issues, and by using sampling methods, he has invaluable studies, not just research, but also for intervention. He is trying to identify interventions in his center, and today he will be talking about assessment and intervention in real life for adolescents with emerging mental health problems.
Okay, I think this is better. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. It will be in English. Unfortunately, I don't speak Turkish, so I hope that's okay and that translators can follow. So indeed, I will talk today about the research that we're doing at the Center for Contextual Psychiatry on assessment and intervention for adolescents with emerging mental health problems. And so basically, contextual psychiatry starts from the idea that mental health problems do not just arise on their own, but that they do arise in a person in interaction with an environment. And that in order to understand that, we need to capture that whole picture. And as Thomas Insel has stated in JAMA 2017, he says, in practice, few clinicians measure emotion, cognition, or behavior with any standard validated tool. And also, of course, then that behavior in interaction with the context. And so what he suggested is that we need a science of behavior in psychiatry to better understand when do people develop problems, what kind of behavior do they do, and how can we measure that. And so what he suggested was to use digital technology as a tool to improve our science of behavior, to get a better understanding of behavior. And so he said people have a smartphone and they do things with that phone. They touch the screen, they get messages. So the speed with which they deal with their phone, the reaction time, maybe we can record voices, we can listen to the voices. So there's a lot of things, and of course there's a lot of sensors on the phone. So there's a lot of things that we can use to understand behavior. And so he said we need to develop a digital phenotype. And based on all these actions with the phone, we can maybe predict who is going to be depressed or who is going to be psychotic. However, I'm not sure whether that is the best use of digital technology. I think one of the things that is missing here is that mental health is also about experience. It's about how you feel and what the experiences you have, as well as the context. So in my view, we can use smartphones in a better way than just you only using those sensors. And we can try to use the smartphone to capture real-life experiences. And in order to do that, for a very long time, basically since the beginning of my research career, I've been working with the experience sampling methodology. And we wrote an overview paper of that in World Psychiatry. And basically, experience sampling is a way of getting people to provide self-reports several times a day over several days on different, on random moments in the day. And so I used to do that. I started with this probably 25 years ago. And then it was just a booklet, paper and pencil, and a watch, and people would get a signal. Nowadays, of course, it's on an app, so now it's digital. And what you ask people is they are in their daily life, and at several moments a day you ask about that specific moment. How do you feel right now? Right now I feel anxious, I feel down, I feel happy, I feel relaxed. But also, what are you doing? Where are you? Whom are you with? How do you experience that context? Do you like the people you're with? Do you feel connected to the people you're with? Do you like the activity you're in? So you get a really nice overview of not only the experiences as well as symptoms, but also the context in which they occur. And you get that at several times a day over a number of days, so giving you a very rich picture of what is actually happening to this person. And so today I want to zoom in on these methods and to really look at different aspects of it. So first of all, I want to discuss, can we use this for assessment of mental health problems? And then later on in the talk, I will move more towards intervention. Can we also use this technology for intervention? So first of all, can we use it to assess mental health in young people? I have a special interest in young people, adolescents. My background is in psychosis research, and of course we know that a lot of these problems occur during adolescence for the first time. So this is a really interesting time to investigate. So I will speak a bit about the Sigma study. This is a cohort study that we did in young people in Flanders. We collected 2,000 12-year-old, 14-year-old, and 16-year-olds in 22 schools spread over Flanders. First of all, so this is general population, young people from schools in Flanders, quite a representative sample in terms of their level of education, urban and rural sites. I have to say more girls than boys, as is usual in this kind of research. And so when we look at the BSI, so that is of course a questionnaire, we see that about 34% had no to very mild complaints, and 48% had mild complaints. However, 17% of this general population, young people, had moderate to severe mental health complaints. And that was pre-corona. This was done in 2018. So quite a substantive number of these young people already present with severe mental health problems. We also had ESM data in all these young people. So we asked them, we gave them a study phone, and we asked them to fill out their questionnaires in their normal daily life. And this gave us quite some interesting results. And the study was led by Olivia Kirtley, who is the postdoc leading this study. For example, we looked at time being alone. And what we found was that, so this is 4 quartiles according to the number of complaints. And so we found that the more psychological complaints you have, the more time you spend alone in your normal daily life. So you see that it's quite a substantive difference from the least psychological complaints with about 10% time alone to the most psychological complaints with over 20% of the time they spent on their own. We also looked into that being alone a little bit more in detail. And so we found that there was a group who mainly had positive feelings when they were on their own. And of course, in adolescence, being on your own is important as well. You need that to develop your own identity, to develop creativity, and so we found that for quite a number of people, being on their own was associated with mainly positive feelings. However, for another group, it was associated with much more negative feelings, the feeling of being excluded, the feeling of being lonely. So we found that about 70% of these adolescents had more that positive attitude towards being alone, whereas for 30%, this was associated with the more negative feelings and feeling excluded. And that, of course, fits then that pattern that we saw, that I just showed you, that being alone for a number of people is also associated with more psychopathology. Now, a nice thing about experience sampling is that we can not only so first of all is that we can look at what is happening in real life while it's happening. So we can look at interacting with the social world while it's happening. And it allows us to do two separate things. So on the one hand, we can sort of look at an objective measure, which is the amount of time you're with others, the amount of time you're on your own. But it also allows us to dig a bit deeper into that, in the feelings and experiences that people have when they are on their own. So we can look at social experiences such as I feel judged, I feel safe, I would rather be with others when alone, or I would rather be alone when with others. How they feel, what their effect is during these social interactions. And so what we found was that if we compare this quality versus quantity of social interactions, again, this is all in the Sigma study, we, as I already showed you, found that being alone was associated with more psychopathology, and also being with, more often being with less familiar people was associated with more psychopathology. There were no differences in being at home or somewhere else, doing nothing or being active, leisure, doing leisure activities more or less. When we then looked at the social experiences, we found something interesting. So what we see is that mainly the social experiences while in company are all associated with psychopathology. So people that have more psychopathology, they feel that the social environment is less pleasant, they feel less safe, they have a higher preference of being alone, they feel more that they're judged, and they have less the feeling that they belong to the company they're with. Now, it's important to realize that these kind of experiences occur across the board. So in every social interaction these are the social interactions that they have from moment to moment, day to day. So it's when they're with their friends, their family, their classmates. We also see that when they're on their own, they feel less safe. So a lot is going on in these social experiences, which seems quite relevant for psychopathology. However, it's something that we hardly catch with any other measure. So I think this is really added value of looking in real life. What's also interesting is that we found that these same kind of things are also related to parental bonding. So we asked the kids about the parental bonding with their parents. And so we found that parents that have a warm, supportive way of parenting, that these kids actually also, you see particularly the consequences in these social experiences, that like a positive, warm, supportive parenting style is associated with enjoying the company more, feeling more safe, have less a preference of being alone, not being judged, and more the feeling that you belong to others. Of course, the other side of the coin is that kids who have parents that are less well capable of providing that kind of environment, then have more consequences in the social experiences. Again, particularly when they are in social company. We also found in these 2,000 adolescents that people with most psychological complaints, so here we see the quartiles again, that they feel more lonely, whether independent of whether they're alone or in company. So you see the light blue is when they're at moments when they're alone, and the dark blue is when they're in company. And you see that in both of these situations, these young people with more mental health problems have a higher feeling of feeling lonely. So what we conclude from this whole story is that what we see in the Sigma study is that mental well-being and social well-being are sort of two sides of the same coin. That young people with mental health problems also have a lot of issues going on in their social environment. That they're more, that they feel more distressed when with others. They have the tendency to isolate. They feel less connection with other people, which of course is an important issue. So a lot is going on in young people, but the question then of course is, can we also measure more severe mental health problems? Because for now I've mainly talked about social interactions, which we see in all kids. But can we also use this methodology to assess, for example, psychosis in young people? And so I will now shift to some other studies that we've done. And this is, for example, a study where we looked at 33 people at clinical high risk for psychosis and 34 people with the first episode of psychosis with an average age of 23. And so the question is, can we measure psychotic experience in daily life in these people at these early stages of psychosis? So, of course, when we ask questions, ESM questions, we cannot just say, are you hallucinating right now, or are you deluded right now? So we need to ask questions that people can self-report about. So what we find is that, so we ask the question, for example, in hallucinations, we ask, do you hear something or do you see something that other people cannot hear or see? And this is something that people in general can respond to quite well. In terms of paranoia, we can of course ask people, do you feel suspicious? You can ask people, do you feel that someone is after you, wants to hurt you? So there are ways of capturing part of the experience that is relevant. So what we saw in this group of people at the early stages of psychosis was that we found about a little more over 20% of the people at clinical high risk reported having hallucinations, and about 40% of the people with the first episode of psychosis reported having hallucinations. When we look at suspiciousness, paranoia, we found much higher numbers. So over 90% of the people at clinical high risk reported having feeling paranoid, feeling suspicious, and about 60% of the people with the first episode reported feeling suspicious. Then we also looked at the comorbidity. So in people with suspiciousness, we found that about 30% of the ultra high risk and about over 50% of the first episode patients reported comorbid hallucinations. So when people had hallucinations, they almost all also had suspiciousness. So there is a high comorbidity between, when you have hallucinations, there's a lot of comorbidity with having suspiciousness as well. Then the interesting thing is that we can also look at the associations over time, because we of course measure at several moments per day, so you can see what occurs first, what comes next. And this is interesting because there's of course a whole literature suggesting that that delusions are sort of a cognitive interpretation of hallucinations or other experiences or abnormal experiences. And so we can actually test that. We could actually see, is this how this works? And so when we look at suspicious episodes, we see that so here you have the number of beeps next to each other. So the first one that you see is sort of beeps unrelated to an episode. Then you have the last one before, the first, during, last, and after. And that is on the y-axis, you see the score, 1 to 7. That people, this is actually the Likert scale that we use to score. And so an episode, of course, is not a psychotic episode, but it's a moment in time when people become more suspicious. Or when, so we're now looking at the moment when people become more suspicious. As you can see in the dark line, this is a psychotic episode. What is happening with hallucinations? And so you see basically that when suspiciousness starts to rise, nothing is happening at the level of hallucinations. So it's not that people first get more hallucinations and then become more suspicious. It seems to be quite unrelated to that. Sorry? Clinical high risk, sorry. That's the clinical high risk group. So this is in the clinical high risk group. Now, when we look at the first episode of psychosis, you see something quite similar. So again, there's a slight increase in hallucinations, but it's relatively independent of the suspicious episode. Now, when we look at the opposite, so when we now look at the moments when hallucinations start to rise, we see that happens against the background of higher levels of suspiciousness. So when people become more suspicious, the chance is higher that they also get more hallucinations. And you see that both in the clinical high-risk group and in the first episode group. So basically what we found in our data is that instead of hallucinations leading to psychosis, we see that delusions actually precede hallucinations. And this is very much in line with what has been called delusional mood, so that people first get this state where they become more suspicious, when they find everything starts to become strange. People feel that the world isn't exactly as they experienced it before, and against that background, they start experiencing hallucinations. We also looked at interactions with the environment. And so, for example, we looked at the effect of stress on these psychotic experiences. And we've looked at stress. So when people have stress, what it does to their negative affect being things like feeling anxious, feeling down, feeling lonely, insecure, but also whether stress affects these psychotic experiences. And so what we found, and this is really interesting, is that if you look here at the first part of the graph, this is the association between negative affects and stress in 3 groups, which is people with established psychosis, people with clinical high risk, and controls. you see that particularly in the people with clinical high risk, stress is associated with more negative affect. And then in the next one, that is MPS, is momentary psychotic symptom. Again, you see that it's mainly the people at clinical high risk who experience more negative affect and more psychotic experiences in moments of stress. So for them, there is clearly a problem with stress reactivity, that they are feeling more distressed or that they have a higher reaction to stressful experiences that happen in their normal daily life. We then also looked at recovery from stress. So not only the peak reaction, what happens at the moment when you feel stressed, but also what happens after that, how quickly do you recover from that? And again, with experience sampling, we have multiple times per day that we follow people. So basically what we did is we looked at all these beeps in a row. We said, okay, at the first moment that there is something stressful happening, that is the T0. Then we have the moment before that, it's T1, T-1, and then we have all the beeps following, which is then T1, 2, 3. And so we can see how long does it take before people recover. And this was in a large sample of 257 people, healthy volunteers, 141 people with early psychosis, so this was both clinical high risk and first episode of psychosis, and 191 people with chronic psychosis. And so what we see is first the peak reaction. So we see that at the moment that they're stressed, people have an increase in negative affect, which is normal, of course, when something stressful happens. And you have to take into account this is normal daily life, so these are the normal stresses, like having a fight with well, your teenage daughter, for example, or being stuck in traffic, or other stressful things that happen to you. You see at these moments, stressful moments in daily life, you have a slight increase in negative affect. The line below is the healthy volunteers, so you see a small increase. Then you see the line in the middle is the people with chronic psychosis. You see a bit of a peak as well, but it's quite similar to the people, to the healthy volunteers. Only their level of negative affect is a bit higher, but the increase when there's stress is not so steep. And then above, in line with the previous slide that I showed you, you see a large increase in negative affect in people at early stages of psychosis when they feel stressed. So there's a large peak. Then when we look further at the next peak, so when we look at recovery, you see, if we start again with the line below, you see that for healthy volunteers, the next moment, they're already back at their normal level of negative affect. So there's something stressful, you see a little peak, and then they're back to normal. Interestingly, in the middle line, which is the people with chronic psychosis, you see the same. So you see a small peak, and then they go back to normal. However, when we look at the group in the upper line, you see a much larger increase in negative affect, and you see also that it takes up to 3 beeps after before they go back to their normal level of negative affect. So they're not only more impacted by stress in terms of their immediate reaction, but it also takes them much longer to recover from that stress. And so up to 3 beeps, that means we measure 10 times a day in time frames of 90 minutes. So that means that this is really a matter of a few hours before they're recovered from small stressors that happen in their normal daily life. We see something similar, although not that extreme, in when we look at the psychotic reaction to stress. So we see, again, a larger peak in psychotic reaction at the upper line, which is, again, the people at the early stages. And here we also see it takes them 2 beeps to recover back. So again, it is, we see a problem with not only stress reactivity, but also stress recovery, especially at the early stages of psychosis. When we think about negative symptoms, we can also measure that. So this time, this was a study with 53 healthy volunteers, 46, and this is clinical high risk or ARMS, at risk mental state. So it's the same group, sorry about the different use of terms here. And 51 people with the first episode of psychosis. And so when we think about negative symptoms, for example, we think about anhedonia, the incapacity to experience pleasure. When we look at emotions, we also know that people with psychosis have a tendency to have more flattened expression, where people are, so people often assume that people don't have that intense emotions. However, when we look at the data and when we use experience sampling methodology, we see that people both with an at-risk mental state and first episode of psychosis have higher levels of intensity of negative affect, also have higher variability of negative affect, meaning that the standard deviation is larger, but also higher instability. And instability is actually the change from moment to moment. So you see that there is much more instability, that people tend to go much more up and down in their negative affect. And so have a large change from moment to moment. Then when we compare that, when we then look at positive affect, which we're interested in particularly with regard to anhedonia, we see that indeed people with an at-risk mental state as well as a first episode tend to report less positive affect compared to healthy volunteers, although they do also in positive affect show higher levels of variability and instability. And so the question is this lower level of positive affect indeed a sign that people are less capable of experiencing pleasure? Is this a sign of anhedonia? And so what we can do in experience sampling is similar to what we did in stress research, where we looked at the association between stress and negative affect. We can also investigate here what is the association between pleasant events. When something pleasant happens, what is the effect on their positive affect? Because that is really what anhedonia is, that when something pleasant happens, you're not able to experience positive affect. Because one explanation of this lower level of positive affect could either be that people are not capable of experiencing pleasure, but an alternative hypothesis could be that maybe people don't have such pleasant lives. Maybe there's not so much reason to have positive affect. And so when we look at the association between pleasant events and positive affects, we indeed see no difference between the both groups. So we see that the people with, that the healthy so the upper line is the healthy volunteers, and then we have the people with psychosis and the people with an at-risk mental state. And you see that all these lines go up, so positive affect is going up whenever the event becomes more pleasant. And this is almost most pronounced in the at-risk mental state. So showing that there's no problem of anhedonia, but there's probably a problem of people not having such pleasant lives. One interesting finding that I don't have a slide of, but that is something that we're looking at more now, is that maybe one of the things that's happening here is that you don't not only see more positive affect, or you don't not only see that positive affect is going up, but that you see a bit more ambiguity, that people also in these cases maybe also have a bit more negative affect at the same time. Then we also looked again at asociality, and so similar to what we found in the Sigma study, where we said that mental health problems are related to spending more time on your own. We see that not so much in the at-risk mental state, but definitely in the people with first episode of psychosis, they spend almost 60% of their time on their own, which clearly, of course, is a problem. The question, of course, is whether this is really asociality as we define it as a negative symptom, or whether this is also a lack of opportunities. The fact that people, when they develop their first episode of psychosis, tend to not be able to work anymore, not be able to be in the normal structured social interactions that a lot of us are. When we look at the way people experience these environments, we see an interesting finding. So we find that people with the first episode of psychosis, so here you see healthy volunteers, at-risk mental states, and first episode of psychosis, that especially those with the first episode of psychosis have, they find the company they're in less pleasant, but interestingly, they also don't like to be alone. So here you see that ambiguity coming, that they don't like the company they're with, but they don't like to be alone when they're alone as well. Then we ask if they're with other people, would you prefer to be alone? People with an at-risk mental state as well as first episodes tend to say, yes, I would prefer to be alone. But when they're alone, they also prefer more than healthy volunteers prefer to be with others. So there is some ambiguity going on in these social relationships. So to conclude this part of the talk, I think we can say that experience sampling is feasible for assessing young people in their normal daily life. I have to say, I didn't mention that during the talk, that in the Sigma study, the compliance rates were lower than we normally see in adults. So it is possible to use experience sampling in young people, but it's a bit harder. They are not so compliant in the sense that they fill out less beeps than we see with adult populations. I think definitely it helps in assessing and understanding real-life circumstances, so we can see these associations that are much harder to find using standard questionnaires, retrospective questionnaires. I think a very interesting finding from the Sigma study, but also from these other studies, is that mental well-being is very much related to social well-being. And that we can capture both aspects of positive symptoms and negative symptoms of psychosis. And that psychosis is related to both increased stress reactivity, especially at these early stages of psychosis, and which is not just stress reactivity, but also a problem with stress recovery. But also with problems in reward learning, and with that I refer to the findings on the anhedonia and the asociality, where you see that there is this ambiguity in, on the one hand, experiencing pleasure when pleasant moments are happening, but then not taking that experience towards having more of these pleasant experiences. Also the ambiguity in the learning is potentially problematic. Okay, so in terms of assessment, I think that topic was covered. And then I want to move into a different aspect of the work that we've been doing, which is intervention in real life. And this is something that we only started to develop over the last years, because as I told you, for a long time, I was doing this research with paper and pencil, and that was, it gave us very interesting results in terms of research and understanding better the psychopathological mechanisms, but it was of course not really a clinical instrument. There's no clinician waiting for getting this booklet full of scores that you then have to type into the computer to get a meaningful association. However, of course, with the very rapid digital technology, suddenly this has become a potential clinical instrument, and has provided us with the opportunity to start developing interventions in real life. So maybe I now, as a little break in this thing, want to ask you something. So who of you learned to ride a bike by just reading a book about it? Or by getting instructions, someone told you how you have to ride a bike and then you could ride your bike? Probably no one. Same holds for driving a car, learning how to cook, learning how to do gymnastics or dance. These are not skills that we learn by hearing about it, reading about it, people telling us about how to do it. No, this is something that you learn by doing it and practicing and practicing and practicing. This is how you develop those skills. So the question is, why do we think that that would help with mental health problems? Because basically what we often do is we see people in our therapy room, we talk about things, we discuss things, but then it's very difficult, and you try to teach people coping skills, you try to teach people how to deal with things, but then it's very difficult for people to translate that to not being paranoid when they're in a very busy street, or hearing voices while shopping, or feeling distressed when doing exams. So how can we actually help people to practice coping skills and different ways of dealing with these issues in their normal daily life? So that is where, for us, digital technology comes in. So how can we actually use digital technology to help people, on the one hand, become more aware of these experiences, and on the other hand, to develop the skills that they need to deal with this? So this is where, for us, ecological momentary interventions come in. So what we do in ecological momentary interventions is basically we try to translate what we learn in the therapy room to daily life by using our smartphone. So we want to deliver the therapy in the real world at moments when it's most needed, provide round-the-clock support, as well as induce that sustainable change. So by letting people practice at different times a day, in different kind of circumstances, you hope that that will help them to develop the skills they need to deal with these difficult circumstances. So we are discussing now blended care. So blended care is really a combination of having, seeing people face to face, but then also using digital technology to extend the therapy in daily life. So this is our, as I said, ecological momentary interventions. And so I now want to focus quite extensively on one blended care therapy that we developed, which is acceptance and commitment therapy in daily life, where we combine face-to-face sessions with an app and people practicing in their daily life. So just very short, acceptance and commitment therapy is of course not something that was invented by us. This has been around for quite some time. It's a third wave therapy developed by Hayes. And it's basically focusing on 6 different aspects, which is acceptance, diffusion, self as context, being in the present, values and committed action. So there's sort of, the acceptance part, which is the present, acceptance, diffusion, self as context, and then there is the commitment part, which is the values and committed action. And the whole goal of acceptance and commitment therapy is increase psychological flexibility, meaning that people sort of can actually do not avoid experiencing negative feelings, and can actually flexibly apply the skills they need at that very moment. So the goals of acceptance and commitment therapy in general are to reduce experiential avoidance, to increase psychological flexibility, and improve well-being and quality of life. Symptom reduction is only seen as a secondary outcome of ACT. So that's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to improve well-being, quality of life. And the idea is that probably as a consequence of all these steps, symptoms will reduce as well, but it's not the primary aim of acceptance and commitment therapy. So, of course, as you know, and as I've already explained, my background is in psychosis, so we are interested to see how would this work in people with psychosis, and then, of course, especially the blended therapy. And so there is this very interesting paper, systematic review and meta-analysis of Mario Alvarez Jimenez's group in Origin in Australia. Came out this year or last year. And so they combine both acceptance and mindfulness-based interventions. So I want to focus your attention specifically on the acceptance-based interventions. So that is always the upper part of the graph. So it's basically the first studies. So what we see, if we look at overall symptomatology, we see in this meta-analysis no effect of, no significant effect of acceptance-based interventions. So again, please focus on the upper part. When we look at positive symptoms of psychosis, again, we don't see a significant effect on positive symptoms. When we look at negative affect, again, for the acceptance-based intervention, the upper part, we see no effect. When we look at social functioning, again, no effect. We did see in that meta-analysis that there was a significant effect on depression, on hospitalization, and on the level of acceptance. However, I want to point out that there were some issues with these, in this meta-analysis. First of all, we see that there's a limited number of studies, and that the trials that are included have a limited number of participants. So basically there haven't been really big studies in psychosis investigating the effect of acceptance and commitment therapy. What is also really clear from this review is that there is no focus on early psychosis. So no studies have been conducted in early psychosis. And then, of course, the question is, can we augment treatment effects by adding that component of digital technology? So, as I said, we developed a blended care intervention. So where basically people got face-to-face sessions with their therapist and got an app as well to practice in their normal daily life. So how does this work? People got 8 sessions of face-to-face therapy, which is, if you look at the average score, it's sort of an average number of sessions. Within the ACT literature, especially related to psychosis, you see a range between 4 and 12 to 15 sessions, but most therapies are around 8 sessions. And then we had the app. And so the app, basically what we did was we asked people to, after every session with their therapist, to use the app for 3 days. So they had a session, and then 3 days the app, and then rest, and then the week after the next session, 3 days app. So after every session, they got the app. And they got 8 beeps per day for 3 days, and they got beep questionnaires, and this is very similar to what we do in experience sampling, shorter though, so they had a few questions on their current moods, their current symptoms, their current environment. But they also got an ACT exercise. So they were asked to do a short exercise which was related to what they did in the therapy session. Or they were provided with an ACT metaphor. ACT is using a lot of metaphors to make people aware of what is actually the topic or what is actually relevant. And so these metaphors are used in the ACT session with the therapist and subsequently is presented to them in the app to remind people of, oh yeah, this is a topic of this week, this is what I have to do. People were also able to go back to the app and do an exercise when they wanted, at moments when they maybe had a bit more time. So this is basically how it looked like. So we had 8 sessions of ACT, but basically the first session was psychoeducation. So we had 1 session of psychoeducation and then 7 sessions of ACT. So these were the sessions. We started with hopelessness, then we had session on acceptance, diffusion, self and mindfulness, values and commitment, and then the last session was sort of a combination of that all. So then we had beep exercises, and in the beginning these beep exercises were about mindfulness, being in the here and now. Then we added acceptance to that, diffusion, self and mindfulness, and then we also started working on values and commitment. So this is starting from week 5. So what we do is we discuss in therapy with people their values, but then we also talk about committed action. So what could you do to work according to these values? And so what people basically do is they decide with their therapist 3 actions, committed actions that they want to work on. And then each morning they decide what they're going to work on that day. And then they're reminded during the beeps or asked whether they've already done that. Of course, these are small things. This is something that people can work on. So if your value is, I want to have better relationships, or if people say, I want to have like a boyfriend or a girlfriend, of course, you're not going to say, okay, today I'm going to work on getting a boyfriend. But you can say, today I want to work on reaching out to people, contacting people, or at least speak to someone else, or like, so small actions that people can actually do. And then we have the action exercises. These are the exercises that are just available, and each time people learn something new, this is added to the pool of potential exercises. So people can just go there and do these exercises. One of the problems of a lot of these EMIs, ecological momentary interventions, is that there's a lack of evidence. So this is a systematic review that was published in GMIR in 2020. And basically what they showed was that over the years, so this is going from 2013 to 2018, that there is an increasing number of studies, but that most of these studies, that a lot of these studies do not even include an assessment, or that they only use at usability or effectiveness, but we really want to look, oh, and this ended up a bit wrong. So we really want to look at the sort of, not the darkest green, but the one above, where we combine not only effectiveness, but also usability. That is really what you want to look at when you develop an app. You can develop something that works perfectly, has 100% effectiveness. But if no one is willing to use it, it's not going to be very effective after all. So you want to develop something that people find acceptable to do, that they would like to do, that they find feasible to do, and at the same time something that is also effective in reducing or in effective in terms of the outcomes that you're interested in. So basically, this is what we wanted to do and test in our research. We wanted to combine both of these issues. And I'm going to show you results of 2 studies. This is the first one. This is a SMART scan study. That was in emerging adults. So this is basically adolescents and young people up to the age of 25. And these were people that reported problems of depression and psychosis, but were not seeking care. So this is really the very early stages of emerging problems. I have to point out that this is only a very small study. So we only had 28 and 27 in each group. And so here we did ACT in daily life as a group session, in group sessions. So it was not an individual intervention, but it was a group intervention of acts and then using the app. And then the control condition was watching a movie together. So every week this group would come together, and instead of having an ACT session, they would just watch a movie together and discuss the movie. We measured people at baseline and post-treatment, and then we followed them up for 6 and 12 months. At baseline and post-treatment, we not only had questionnaires, but we also asked people to do a week of ESM. In this pilot study, the ACT therapy was actually only 5 ACT therapy sessions in groups. And then, similar to what I just explained, they had the beeps, they had the acts. So the ACT in daily life part was completely identical to what I just explained, only this was only in 5 sessions. So in terms of feasibility, the 36% attended all the sessions of the ACT, and only 14% attended all the movie sessions. On average, people attended 4.3 sessions of the ACT-EL and 3.7 of the movie. In terms of the number of beeps and the exercises, etc., so you see that people use the app quite extensively. They have, these are the 6 weeks that they're working with the app. So you see that they have between 10 and 14 interactions in terms of the beeps. Then the exercises, they do a number of exercises. Also some exercises on demand, so people use it. We then look at our primary outcome measure, which was subthreshold psychopathology. We found that indeed in the interview-rated depression, so that was the Madras, we see that post-intervention, the ACT-EL group does significantly better than the film group. However, so this was a significant interaction. However, when we looked at the self-reported items, we found no significant differences between the 2 conditions in self-reported depression, anxiety, or general psychopathology. So none of this. So we saw that basically over time all the groups improved, but it was not different between conditions. When we looked at self-reported distress related to psychotic experiences, we found something interesting. Actually, the self-reported distress was higher in the ACT-EL group compared to the film group. This was a bit a puzzling finding, of course. You aim to reduce distress. One explanation could be that with ACT-EL, you actually want to reduce experiential avoidance, so maybe people allow more to feel how distressing this is, but that of course was a bit of a problematic finding. When we look at psychological flexibility, we've again also found that at the post-treatment level, we found that people had more negative affect compared to to previous. Again, this could be related to that experiential avoidance, where people are more in connection with their feelings and allowed to feel the pain more. but we found no effects on psychological flexibility and daily life positive affect. However, as I said, so what we learned from this study is that, one, it is feasible to do something like that, but also that we have to look at follow-up and need to really investigate this in a larger sample. So this is what we did in the INTERACT study. So the INTERACT study is a large study where we again combine acceptance and commitment therapy with the app. And we did that and we compared that to 2 conditions. Because that is one of the other things that we learned from the film condition, is that maybe in these people with, at the early stages, very, very early, like they're not even seeking help, that just being in contact with other people that have similar experiences in itself already is a treatment. So now we moved a bit up the range, so we're not looking at these very early stages, but we're looking now at clinical high risk and first episode of psychosis. And so these were all people that were in care for these problems, and we compared the ACT in daily life with treatment as usual. And treatment as usual actually consisted of 2 different groups. So we had a number of centers in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, in The Hague, Maastricht, and Eindhoven. And what we see as treatment as usual in these centers usually consists of assertive community treatment and individual therapy, mostly structured CBT for psychosis, as well as pharmacological treatment. In comparison, the centers in Belgium, their treatment as usual looks like slightly different. So in Belgium, it's more individual counseling, more group therapy, and pharmacological treatment. And so we randomized people in all the different centers in either control or control or experimental condition. But the control condition was whatever happened in their centers. So if that was structured CBT, it was structured CBT. If that was individual counseling in a non-structured manner, that was what it is. So therefore, we have basically a treatment as usual, a control group, which consists of structured CBT versus other interventions as treatment as usual. So this is what this study looks like, and I've done this in close collaboration with Ulrich Reininghaus, who's a professor in Mannheim currently, and we jointly led this study. So again, we have baseline and post measurements where we follow people at 6 and 12 months. We have experience sampling at baseline, post-measurement, and 6 months. And so we randomized 148 people with an at-risk mental state and a first episode of psychosis. That makes this one of the largest studies in psychosis and one of the first studies in the early phases of psychosis. So let's first have a look at the 71 people that were randomized in the ACT-DL group. This was published in trials, so the protocol was published in trials, and we also pre-registered all the analyses on the open science framework. So basically, we randomized 148 people, 71 in the ACT-DL and 77 in the treatment as usual. And then, of course, we had loss over time, ending up with 42 in each group at 12-month follow-up. So first of all, let's again look at acceptability and feasibility. So we found that people on average participated in 6 out of the 8 sessions. 62% attended to all sessions, and 13% did not attend any session. So these are people that we had the baseline assessment, Then they were randomized, and then they didn't show up at any of the sessions. And then we had 18 people that had between 1 and 7 sessions, and this is what it looks like. So you see that it's a bit distributed across the board, but most people attended all 8 sessions. When we look at the use of the app, it's a slightly worse picture. So every week people had the opportunity to respond to 24 beeps, 3 days with 8 beeps, and we only got 6 out of 24 beeps that people responded to. So that's an adherence of 25%. However, when we combine every interaction with the app, we see a bit different picture. So this is people, as I said, people can also do the exercises on their own. So when we look at the entire number of interactions with the app, we see that people overall have about 12 to 14, 15, 16 interactions with the app per week. And these are the 7 weeks that they are doing, and you see that the number is quite consistent. Even at the 6th session, 16 interactions, and at the 7th session, still 11 interactions. So, of course, although potentially the number could be much higher, we still have 14 to 16 interactions with the app every week, which is quite substantial. When we look at acceptability, we found that people found it quite useful. So you see that, of course, this is the more green it gets, the better. So people found it useful. They said that it helped them implement the exercises in their daily life, and that it helped them to become more aware of their feelings. However, there was also the burden side. So when we asked people, was it burdensome in terms of length of the beep, so the number of questions they had to fill out at every moment, they said yes, it was quite burdensome, and also the number of beeps per day they felt to be quite burdensome. We asked them, do you think you will use the ACT exercises in the future? And most of them thought very much so. When we look at what people actually used to work, so we not only had an app, we also provided them with a workbook. We see that 39% says they used both the app, the workbook, and exercised on their own, and 39% used the app and the workbook. So about 80% said they were using the app and the workbook, and 11% was using the app only. So over 90% of the people used the app, whereas 9% did not use the app. We also did some qualitative research. We asked them, what did you like, what were strong points, what were problems? So when we talk about the app, they say that some people mention it's nice that the app is connected to the session. A number of people say they want to keep using the app after the study, and that the app is helping them to integrate ACT principles in their daily life. On the downside, people mainly mentioned technical problems. There were also quite a lot of technical problems with the app. And some people say there was no connection between the app questionnaire and the session, so there's a bit of a divide on that. And some people had generally a negative opinion about the app. When we look at the exercises specifically, people liked that they could freely choose which exercise to do, and that the app is helpful to remember the exercises and to do them more often. Some people found the exercises not useful or found it difficult to do the exercises, for example, when they were at work. And then the ESM questionnaire, for most people, they said this increased their awareness of their feelings, thoughts, and symptoms. And some people had positive attitudes towards the questions, whereas other people felt that the timing was often inconvenient, that there were too many beeps, and it took too long to fill out. So in terms of acceptability, I think people were capable of doing this. we're on average okay with doing this, but we also have to listen to the feedback of people saying that it is too burdensome, that it is too much. So we need to adjust that because, again, as I said earlier, we can develop something that works perfectly, but if people are not doing it, then it's not helping in the end. So we need to adjust that. But then let's look at effectiveness. This something come out of that. So our primary outcome measure was psychotic distress as measured with the CARMS, which is a structured interview. So what you see here is that pre-treatment, there was a lot of distress, as you can see in both groups. However, this reduced significantly post at 6 and 12-month follow-up. But as you can see, this decreased in both groups equally. So both groups show a decreased, so treatment as usual is equally effective in reducing psychotic distress as is ACT in daily life. However, when we look at the experience sampling measures, so the experience sampling that we did pre and post, we see something different. So here you see the association between psychotic experiences and the distress in terms of negative affect. And you see that the line is steeper for the blue color, which is treatment as usual only, versus the red color, which is ACT in daily life. And it even becomes more, the difference becomes even larger at 6-month follow-up. So what we see in daily life is that in the treatment as usual group, psychotic experiences are associated with more negative affects compared with the ACT-TL group. We also looked at symptomatology more broadly as secondary outcome measures. We found some small effects, so ACT-TL was doing slightly better on overall psychopathology, but only at 6-month follow-up. And the same for affective symptoms, but we found no effect on manic or positive symptoms. We also looked at negative symptoms, and here we found something very interesting. So what we see in negative symptoms is that we measured that both with the BPRS and with the BNSS, and we see a very similar pattern across the board. And so what we see is basically that in treatment as usual only, that negative symptoms tend to increase at 6 and 12-month follow-up. Whereas what we see in ACT-TL is that actually negative symptoms decrease and tend to decrease further. One of the reviewers of this paper said, how is this possible that you only would see this result at 6 and 12-month follow-up? Which treatment does not show? Normally, with intervention studies, you see the largest effect immediately post-treatment, and then afterwards the effect diminishes. And this is something interesting we see with this kind of interventions, with EMIs. What we do is we change patterns of behavior in daily life. We try to build skills, and often these changes in pattern of behavior only takes their effect after time. So in the beginning, the effect is quite subtle. So post-treatment, the effect is not that clear yet. But as people really change things in their normal daily life, it keeps having an effect, and the effect becomes stronger and stronger over time. Actually, one of the explanations of these findings is that probably negative symptoms may be related to this problem of experiential avoidance. That negative symptoms are sort of a reaction to this overwhelming, painful and distressing experiences of psychosis, and that people try to push that away and avoid that, which may result in more negative symptoms. And that by actually learning people to sort of accept these experiences and embrace them in a certain way, that you actually avoid this development of negative symptoms over time. We found a similar effect for functioning. So both for self-reported social functioning as well as global functioning, we found an increase in functioning in the ACT-DL group. And this was already present post-treatment and remained present over time at 6 and 12-month follow-up, although not at 6-month follow-up, a 12-month follow-up for the self-reported social functioning. So again, functioning being one of the most difficult areas to treat, as well as negative symptoms, we found significant relationships in both. There was no difference between ultra-high risk and first episode patients, so the pattern of association is the same in both groups. We had about half first episode, half was ultra-high risk, and also we found no differences between the CBT and the tau only groups. We also looked at underlying processes. So in terms of psychological flexibility, we found if we measure this again with a questionnaire, the FIT-6C, we found no differences in psychological flexibility. So we see an effect over time. Flexibility is going up, but it's the same in treatment as usual as in ACT-DL. However, again, when we use experience sampling, similar to the psychotic distress, we also see an increase in momentary openness when at post-intervention, and we also see a difference in the acceptance or the opposite. So I try not to think about my negative emotions or thoughts. So reverse court, of course, and I let my thoughts be without reacting to them. So again, at a daily life level, we see some effects on these psychological flexibility measures. We also looked at the relationship between ACT and stress reactivity and reward processes. And so in terms of stress reactivity, we again at follow-up, so not at post-intervention, but at follow-up, we found that people had less negative, less NA, negative affect at post-intervention in response to stress in the ACT-DL compared to the controls. So that was both when we have activity stress and social stress. So you see both the red lines going down at follow-up, suggesting that people have less stress reactivity. And we also see more positive affect in stressful situations. When we look at rewards, we see not an effect on positive affect. So this is again reaction to pleasant events. But again, in the ACT-DL, we see that there is less negative affect reactivity. And that is, I talked about the ambiguity in negative affect and positive affect. So this could actually be one of the mechanisms. So what do we learn from all these things? We are now moving the INTERACT study to actually the IMPACT study. INTERACT was funded by the European Commission consolidated grant, and we then also received a proof of concept grant to really bring this to the clinic. And so first of all, what we did in the IMPACT study is that we optimized the app for the clinic. So that means that we have reduced the number of beeps. We listened to what the patient said as well as the clinicians. Another thing that clinicians told us was we want this to be more modular so that we can actually choose which session to start with. In the trial, we always started with creative hopelessness and then went to acceptance, etc. But some people want to start with the committed actions and the values. So now it is more flexible. People can use the app in a more flexible way in their clinical practice. We also made the metaphors more flexible so that the clinician can actually decide which metaphor to use. So to use the ones that most speak to the people. We prepared an official trainer's manual, and now we're running an implementation pilot because that is really one of the problems that I see with ecological momentary interventions. As I showed you, there's an increasing number of studies looking at in ecological momentary interventions, but we also have to get it into the clinic. So what you see right now is that people develop new interventions and then it stops. It's not used, it's not actually implemented in clinical practice. And so this is really one of the big issues, and I think rather than creating more and more and more ecological momentary interventions, we actually have to invest in implementation studies where we actually investigate how can we get this to the clinic, what are the barriers. And one of the barriers, of course, is technology, because, I mean, when we were doing CBT, for example, you just read a book, you got a manual, you got to work. Now there is technology involved, there is data involved, so who owns the data, where are the data, who makes sure that the data are private and secure, how does this connect to the digital, to the electronic patient files that people use in their clinics. Also, what is the long-term sustainability? Who will make sure that this app keeps working? If your patients start working with this, you also want this to work when there is the next operating system, or when we move from smartphones to smart glasses or smart watches or whatever. So there's a long-term sustainability issue. There's, of course, also an issue of regulations. This needs to go through medical device regulation, which is different in Europe compared to the US, for example, to other parts of the world. What is the business model? Who's going to pay for this? So there's a lot of issues that we really still need to tackle, and that we are working on quite hard. But in general, I think not just for our ACTL app, but for apps in general, there is really an issue of implementation. So we need more evidence-based, we need this kind of large-scale studies that focus both on acceptability and on effectiveness, but then also we need to work on implementation. And that sort of brings me to the end of my talk. So I think to conclude, I can say that conclude this part of my talk, I can say that ACTL is feasible for people in the early stages of psychosis, that the absolute compliance with the app is low, yet the number of interactions is still substantial, that optimization is needed based on stakeholder feedback. This is what we're currently working on. That ACTL is not improving psychotic distress over treatment as usual, but is better at improving negative symptoms and functioning. Of course, I want to be very clear on this. This was one of our secondary outcome measures based on what we saw in the meta-analysis. This was not expected, but of course, the meta-analysis did not include specifically people at the early stages of psychosis. And of course, we need further efficacy testing. We need to replicate this finding, definitely. And this needs to be compliant with implementation studies. But overall, I think we're quite optimistic that this may be an important alternative treatment for people at the early stages of psychosis. I also want to point out, before I close my talk, that if people are interested in doing ESM research, and I have to stress that it is about research, we are running workshops at KU Leuven, and the next workshop is coming up, and on the 9th, 10th, and 11th of March 2022. So if people would be interested in joining, reach out to us. We also just have a book out, which is the Open Handbook of Experience Sampling Methodology. This is an open handbook. That means that it's free. So you can go to our website and download the book if you're interested. If you want to have a printed version, you can go to Amazon, and there you can buy the book at print cost. I just want to make sure, if you go to Amazon, make sure that the vendor is Amazon, because the book already has been stolen and is offered for much higher prices. So it should be around, yeah, sorry, I only know the price in euros, but it should be between 15 and 20 euros and not more. So if it's offered at a higher price, you're probably at, not at the right vendor. So, that makes me conclude. Of course, this is not work that I've done just by myself. This is work of my lab. This is a Center for Contextual Psychiatry with all the senior staff, the support staff, and all the PhD students. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions if we still have time. 5 minutes left for that.
Thank you so much for your inspiring presentation. Maybe we can take one question, please.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I'm sorry there's only time for one question. I'm sure other people have interesting questions. I just put my hand up first. I have a lot of questions, but one, and I'll approach you afterwards in the break, but one of the questions I had is, it's very interesting, this delay in negative symptom change, and it makes perfect sense that in this population there's a lifestyle pattern change that leads to that. This is an interesting dynamic age group, different from people with lifelong problems with psychosis. Do you think that life changes in people with longer-term psychosis could result in these changes in negative symptoms?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Of course, people with more chronic psychosis, things are quite different, of course. So I wouldn't be sure whether the effects on negative symptoms, for example, would be similar. Although, on the other hand, theoretically, and when we started this, people were saying, well, you know, acceptance, diffusion, this is something for people with more chronic problems. It's not going to be relevant for people at these early stages. They're not ready yet to sort of accept. So in that sense, I would say that I do see possibilities for this kind of intervention in that group as well, especially with relation to functioning. Whether there's the same effect, whether in established negative symptoms you would find a similar effect, I agree with you. I wouldn't be sure of that. Yeah.
Maybe we may take one additional question. Okay. Maybe sorry. Inez, maybe I can ask a question. Did you assess specific relation of specific emotions of individuals between the relation of emotion and psychotic symptoms, specific emotions, maybe guilt, anxiety, etc.?
Yes, so no, we didn't do that. So we looked at negative affect and positive affect in general. That is one of the things that we're actually now also changing in the app. So one of the things that people felt was that there was, in the app as we developed it here, there was no immediate feedback. So people were doing it, but they were not using the data so they were seeing their clinician, then they did the app, and then next time they saw the clinician, they just continued with the sessions. Now we've provided a dashboard where actually the clinician and the patient can look at responses. And by doing that, it also allows to look a bit more specifically at individual emotions that are relevant for that particular patient. And so we feel and we hope that by inducing that sort of feedback, that people will also become more inclined to use the app more often, because then it also becomes kind of rewarding that you do that and then you speak to your therapist and you actually see the results of what you've done, and you can also see the changes over time. And I may also then use this time to advertise the workshop that I will be doing the next session, where I will not talk about ACT-DL, but where I will talk about how we can implement experience sampling and measuring these things and providing feedback in clinical practice.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bahçet Hocam.
Only for psychosis, is it? You know, to me, it seems it can be applicable to GAD, for example, very well. They are constantly on edge, constantly tension, and it affects their muscles, so relaxation might help them as well, and for depression as well.
Yeah, if I understand it correctly, your question is whether it's specifically for psychosis or available.
Only for psychosis.
No, definitely not. And I think that is one of the nice things about these third wave interventions, of course. They're not symptom specific. This was also one of the arguments that I had with Mark van der Gaag, who is a CBT researcher. And he said, yeah, but we're not targeting the symptoms. I said, yes, that's exactly the idea. We're not targeting the symptoms. We're targeting experiences, distressing experiences, whatever they are. And so in that sense, I think this could be used in any ACT intervention for any diagnosis. Only we focused on psychosis because it's my background as a psychosis researcher, but also because it hasn't been investigated very often in psychosis. So we felt that if we can show this in psychosis, that would be actually very strong. But I think in depression, anxiety, compulsive, whatever, this would definitely be feasible. And so the implementation study that we're currently running is transdiagnostic. We're including all kinds of diagnoses.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you Inez again. Teşekkürler katılımınız için.
Thank you for your participation. Have a good congress.